The prospect of a 30-day ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, brokered through US mediation in Saudi Arabia, appears increasingly precarious. While Ukraine, under President Zelensky's leadership, has agreed to a temporary cessation of hostilities, the question remains whether the Kremlin will reciprocate. And given Russia's recent territorial gains and the shifting global landscape, particularly because of Trump's administration's erratic handling of intelligence sharing and arms supplies to Ukraine, there are strong reasons to believe Moscow will refuse the deal, or at the very least demand major concessions. In military conflicts, parties negotiate from a position of strength, and Russia has, in the last few days, seized back strategic territories in the Kursk region and reinforced its presence in occupied Ukrainian territories. And President Putin's recent visit to the front line, or at least the Putin doppelganger's visit to the front line, donned in combat gear alongside General Valery Gerasimov, sent a clear message: Russia intends to continue its advance. With fresh battlefield momentum, a ceasefire would halt this progress, depriving the Kremlin of the ability to press its current advantage. Furthermore, the Russian military, aided by North Korean munitions and Iran-supplied drones, has ramped up its missile and drone strikes on key Ukrainian cities, including Odessa and Kharkiv. And this escalation signals that Moscow is in no hurry to pause operations. Why agree to a ceasefire now when the tide appears to be turning in the direction of the aggressor? The Trump administration's role in these negotiations adds another layer of unpredictability. Just weeks ago, Trump's spat with Zelensky over military aid led to a suspension of US intelligence sharing and weapons shipments, and this brief but critical pause weakened Ukrainian defense capabilities at a crucial moment, allowing Russia to exploit gaps in intelligence and counteroffensive planning. And although the US has now resumed military aid and Ukraine has had another successful strike on an oil refinery, Trump's insistence that Ukraine must negotiate from a realistic standpoint has fueled European concerns that Washington is prioritizing its own optics over Kyiv's security. History will report on Trump's meddling with a very, very dim view. Trump's comments about using economic pressure on Russia to enforce a ceasefire are equally dubious, given his historical reluctance to impose meaningful sanctions on Moscow. If anything, Putin may see this as an opportunity to extract further concessions rather than a serious threat to his existence. Two fundamental deal breakers loom over these negotiations: security guarantees for Ukraine and the question of territorial control. Zelensky has made it clear that Ukraine cannot accept any agreement that leaves his country vulnerable to future Russian aggression, and NATO membership remains a non-starter for Moscow, as does the stationing of Western forces in Ukraine. Yet, without concrete guarantees of security, Kyiv would essentially be signing a temporary pause before another invasion. On the territorial front, Russia continues to hold roughly 20% of Ukraine, including Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. And ceding any of these regions in any formal agreement would be anathema to Ukraine's sovereignty. And despite some vague remarks by US officials about land discussions, Kyiv has remained firm on this point. Meanwhile, Ukraine's own incursion into the Kursk region provides it with a modest bargaining chip, one that Russia is actively working to neutralize, and that Trump's actions have seriously compromised. Beyond the battlefield and diplomacy, there is Putin's domestic purpose to consider. The Russian president has long cultivated an image of defiance against Western pressure, and accepting a ceasefire orchestrated by the US and Ukraine without extracting major concessions could undermine that narrative, and the Russian public, conditioned by years of state propaganda, expects victory, or at least continued defiance. A ceasefire perceived as US imposed would risk internal political instability, something Putin could not and cannot afford. Additionally, Russian lawmakers have already voiced skepticism. Senior figures such as Konstantin Kosachev have insisted that agreement must be on our terms, not American terms. Such rhetoric makes it politically challenging for Putin to accept the proposal without securing significant face-saving measures. And the European Union has not taken kindly to Washington's backroom negotiations with Moscow over the heads of European stakeholders. A recent joint declaration by the European Parliament condemned what it called the US's blackmail of Ukraine into accepting a ceasefire. While Trump has dismissed European concerns in the past, such rifts between Western allies ultimately weaken the broader strategic effort to counter Russian aggression. Moreover, the return of US military support to Ukraine complicates any diplomatic overtures because Russia knows that each passing day of a ceasefire allows Ukraine to rearm, reorganize, and attack again. A temporary truce might provide Ukraine the breathing room it needs to strike back harder in the future. And given these factors, Russia's rejection of the 30-day ceasefire seems not only likely, but almost inevitable. Moscow has little strategic incentive to halt operations now, especially when it's regaining lost territory and still maintains leverage over the West. Furthermore, with Trump's unpredictable involvement and Europe's growing frustration with Washington's approach, the global calculus favors continued conflict rather than temporary peace. While diplomatic effort shouldn't be dismissed outright, expecting an imminent ceasefire is, at best, wishful thinking. In all likelihood, Putin will delay, demanding further concessions, and use the ceasefire discussions as a tool to divide his adversaries, rather than as a genuine step towards ending this war.